Action. All right. So this is the second video of week 1 of Oceanography 101. It was 112 at another institution I talked about it. So we went over the class procedures. You've started to get acquainted with how things work and connect here. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about what oceanography actually is. And I love this animation. It's one that I made myself several years ago of basically that shows a lot of different elements of the ocean system. So what you're looking at here is a number of satellite photos of the Earth taken over the course of several different weeks. This was done by, I can't remember which of the different satellites, but so you just sort of notice this. You'll notice the interesting patterns in the way different clouds move. Notice how near the equator, the clouds are moving from east to west, whereas you get in sort of the mid latitudes, both north and south hemisphere, that the clouds move from west to east. This is one of the more fun elements in the world. You see little things. You'll see that some latitudes seem to be a lot cloudier right here at the equator. You can even see a couple of these little hurricanes sort of spinning off the equator, which is really exciting. You notice that some latitudes, especially the ones that tend to not have a lot of clouds, tend also to have a lot of brown land looking, indicating that's probably pretty dry. You can see this beautiful sort of Sahara Desert. Notice it goes a little bit further north into the Central Asia. Here we have Australia. Notice how dry West Central Australia seems to be. And notice this beautiful little cloud-free area in Western South America. Everywhere else seems to get clouds, but this one area in South America doesn't get a lot of clouds. You can also see a little corner of a cloud-free region here. These little things marching across the screen are just gaps in satellite coverage. This is a mosaic stitched together from like hundreds and hundreds of satellite photos using great technology. This is clear during summer because Antarctica is looking fairly dark, and which means it's not getting light or not enough light for the satellites to generate useful images from it. So yeah, so we're going to go into what is oceanography. We're going to cover why we study oceanography and go over a little bit about what we're going to study here. So first of all, this is probably one of the best campuses to take an intro to oceanography class because we are basically right next to the ocean. We are like Oceanside is in our name, or this was originally scheduled to happen at San Elijo campus, which is named after a lagoon. This is so cool. So the reason I am excited about oceanography is that whole concept of ingredients for life. That is to say that when we look at other planets, we look for planets that have water in them. This is one reason that Europa is thought to be a decent contender for life, or Enceladus, the moon of Saturn, both of which have vast oceans underneath their icy shells and a source of energy and potentially nutrients. So oceans contain most of the world's known water, at least presently. I've heard some arguments that there's water trapped in the mantle, but certainly most of our water is in the oceans. And that oceans and space are our best category for life. We're going to talk also a bit about the scientific method. And we're going to talk a little bit about ancient mariners, probably starting out on later in the semester, but not too much. So a little bit more about water. One of the cool things about our planet is that there's life everywhere. This is Antarctica, one of the coldest places on Earth. The dry valleys, also a very vast desert. But because there's a little bit of water coming up this glacier, and some of that water ends up interacting with some of the rocks here chemically, you have a bunch of bacteria. We also find life on volcanoes. Again, the key ingredient here is water. We find also Life on volcanoes underwater. This is a mid-ocean ridge, a collection of tube worms that we find under the surface. Then finally we have, this is one that I'm really excited. This is one that I am proud to say I was probably one of the first people outside of Antarctica to see this photograph. I had a friend who was standing over the borehole when this photograph was taken. This is a fish underneath the Antarctic ice sheet. It's right where the ice goes from basically rubbing up against the earth to coming afloat, and but to get here, you either have to drill through about 3,000 feet of ice, or you have to pilot a submarine 500 miles from the nearest open ocean surface. Now, in this case, what they did is it's a lot easier to drill a borehole than pilot a submarine in what would be basically an ice-covered ocean. So that's how they did this. And they found this little guy. Clearly does not look like a whole lot, but wow. And so I always tell people that, like, one constant advisory, we're going to talk about evolution. We're going to talk about all this. So we talk a bit about respiration, which is the reaction of most life undergoes. Water plus oxygen plus sugar gives you carbon dioxide, water, and energy. But the reverse of it, carbon dioxide, gives you, it's a reversible reaction. And so again, the oceans contain the overwhelming majority of our water, and because of that, the presence of oceans is effectively what allows water, clouds, rivers, lakes, all of these, because everything is in some way, shape, or form tied to the ocean. So if our planet was made of the same rocks that we have here presently, but we had no oceans, those rocks would cease to be the rocks that we know. In fact, we see on places like Venus, we do not see anything near like what we see on the rocks on Mars, or the rocks on Earth. And when we go to Mars, we see rocks that look a lot more like Earth rocks, because at one point, Mars is understood to have had some kind of ocean present in its northern hemisphere. And to give you a little more scale of this, to give you a sense just how much the world's water is locked up in the oceans, oceans represent about 96.5% of the world's water. Whereas, and definitely almost all the world's saline water. Freshwater represents only 2.5% of the water, and most of the world's fresh water is not going to be very easy for us to drink. It's locked up in places like Antarctica and Greenland. And I can say that because, like, yes, we have glaciers in places like the Sierras, places like Alaska, Iceland, the Alps, the Himalaya, and other large mountain ranges, but the overwhelming majority of the world's ice is trapped in ice in either the poles, in one of the polar regions, either Greenland or Antarctica. Whereas the atmosphere, yeah, it's only very small amounts. Even with the super sticky weather we've been having the last week or so, that represents only a very, very, very small fraction of the world's water. And that needs surface water. Fresh water is actually a very accessible fresh water, is very, very small portion of it. So a little bit about what makes an ocean an ocean. Because if you look at a world map, you see several larger, major bodies of water and then small bodies of water. So we're going to introduce a little bit of vocabulary in today's class. First thing it's going to introduce is that we have 4 oceans. The Pacific, by and large, represents approximately half the world's ocean water. The Atlantic and Indian represent almost half of the remaining water. The Arctic is relatively teeny, but it is considered an independent ocean because it's somewhat cut off from circulation versus the Indian and Atlantic. So what else makes an ocean an ocean? Well, one thing that makes an ocean, you've probably heard the phrase, deep as an ocean. And indeed, that is the case. All the major ocean basins, all the deepest points on Earth's crust are in the major ocean basins, with the deepest places being in the Atlantic and the Pacific, then second deepest in the Atlantic, which still has very, very deep places, and the Indian also has deep places. By contrast, actually, the Arctic, even though it does have some very deep sea floor, the seafloor of the Arctic Ocean tends to be, on average, quite a bit shallower. Some of that's because it's a much smaller ocean. Some of that's also because the continental shelves extend underwater for a much greater distance in the Arctic Ocean, especially around Russia and Alaska and Canada. Overall, they hold the most water. And just to give you a sense of what this depth is like, a good way to think about this is the tallest mountain on Earth is Mount Everest. At least in terms of distance from sea level to the peak's summit. And so if you take Mount Everest and turn it upside down, dumped it into the deepest ocean trench, there would still be 10,000 feet of water above the summit of Everest. That is, the deepest ocean trenches are far vast. And also, we know more about the surface of Mars, the Moon, Venus even, than we know about the sea floor in some way. We've been to all those places by this point, which is kind of awesome, but it's hard to see. There's still vast mysteries. When I was at Scripps, I saw several PhDs, especially in the Dave Sandwell's lab, basically get their degrees on mapping, creating better techniques to precisely map the seafloor and its evolution. Let's go just give you a scale. We have Earth does not even have the biggest oceans. Europa or Titan are thought to have more water than our planet. And this is one of the reasons they're both considered good candidates for life. So here's some more examples of oceans outside of Earth. We have the geysers on Europa. In the case of Europa, we have some oceans near the surface. In fact, recently I saw a really interesting article about how they think the entire outer shell of Europa rotated substantially within the last few millions of years. I hope someday to talk about someone about that. I've got some friends who have done extensive work here. We also have oceans on places like Titan. This, however, is not an ocean of water. This is an ocean of methane and ethane, hydrocarbons. The reason these oceans don't burn is there's not enough oxygen on Titan to make them burn, but we do think they would if you, but yeah.